Morning, everyone. This is Ajahn Brahmali from the Janago Retreat Center in Perth. And I am very thankful for being allowed to take part in this little video conference, online conference. And it's a wonderful way of using modern technology to use it in this way, especially at this time when it's so hard to do anything in physical proximity. It's great to have these technological solutions instead. So what a wonderful thing that is. And surprise, surprise, the theme of this little conference is Buddhism in the time of COVID. So I don't know if you're already sick of hearing about COVID, but if you are sick about even from hearing from it, you're going to be really sick if you actually get it. So I hope you're okay with a bit more COVID information before eventually, hopefully the whole thing will peter out eventually, obviously. So what I want to talk about today is the connection between COVID and right view, or if you like, illness and right view, being the same thing, because this is a very interesting connection, I think a very important one that is often underemphasized, the idea of right view on the Buddhist path. And if you look at the suttas, what the Buddha has to say about right view, you start to realize how fundamentally important it is for the Buddhist practice. And I think, again, it is very easy to underestimate how important it is. And once you realize how important it is, of course, you start to put more effort into actually acquiring that right view and how to think about the world in the right way, so that you enable yourself to really give a boost to this whole practice of Buddhism. And one of the, of course, obvious places where right view occurs is in the Noble Eightfold Path. At the very beginning of the Noble Eightfold Path, we have right view, and this is very significant. It is very significant because the Noble Eightfold Path is the most important of all the doctrinal frameworks, if you like, that we have for explaining what Buddhism is all about or how to practice Buddhism. It is also very important because the Noble Eightfold Path is a causal sequence or a conditioned sequence, which means that you start with the first one, and from the first one, the other ones actually arise from the first one. They're not independent factors that exist completely in a vacuum in their own right. They arise in a particular sequence. And of course, if you have a causal sequence, a conditioned sequence, then the very first factor obviously is going to be very important, because all the other ones depend on that first factor for their existence and also for their fulfillment as you move along. So it's right view is a dynamic thing. It's something that kind of it changes all the time, and you hopefully over time you get closer and closer in your own mind to the right view that the Buddha is talking about. So for this reason, it is so fundamental. It's at the very base of this practice of Buddhism that we are all trying to implement. That is one way of looking at it. If you look at the suttas in many different places, you look at the dependent origination, of course, the dependent cessation sequence, where dependent origination, the whole thing stops, you make an end of dukkha, also in a sense starts with right view. It starts with vijja, and vijja is just another way of talking about right view, really. If you look at the 5 spiritual faculties, if you look at the vast number of places, the gradual training, whatever it is, right view is right there at the very base, at the very start of this thing we call the Buddhist practice. So very important. But what another thing that makes right view interesting is that not only is it true for the path as a whole, but it's also true for individual meditation practices. To have right view matters. When you sit down to meditate, you actually want to have right view to back up your meditation practice. And this is another thing which I think often is not quite understood. And very interesting, if you go to the Satipatthana Samyutta, the connected discourses on mindfulness meditation. There's a large number of discourses there on mindfulness meditation, Satipatthana specifically. It says there are 2 things that are the basis and the foundation for meditation practice or Satipatthana practice, which of course includes things like mindfulness of breathing. 2 things that are the base for that. What are those 2 things? And not surprisingly, one of the bases is sila, which you might expect, which is sila. What is sila? Sila is morality, maybe not the best translation, more like character or habit or who you are as a person, is maybe a better way of translating sila. It's a very broad category that encompasses much more than what we normally think of as morality in the English language. So that is there, and then on the other hand you have Ujjuka Ditti. And Ujjuka Ditti is just another way really of talking about right view. Ujjuka means straight, and Ditti of course is view. So this is very like straight and right are actually etymologically related words, and they are very similar in their meaning and what they're referring to. So Ujjuka Ditti is also a foundation for meditation practice. Right view, right there for meditation practice itself. Why is that? And one reason why that is the case, obviously, is that the purpose of the path is to eventually see things according to reality. Yata Bhuta Jnanadasana, seeing things according to reality, that is the purpose. So you have to start out with a preliminary right view to be able to get the full right view down the track. But that, I don't think that is the main meaning in this case. I think the main meaning for why Ujjuka Ditti is important for meditation practice is that to enable you to watch the breath, to enable you to be with your meditation object, you have to have the right kind of attitude towards it. You have to have an interest in it. You have to know why it is important, why it matters. And what that is all about is to enable you to move your attention away from the world, not taking refuge in the world. And this is what the Buddha says in many places, like in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, to move your attention away from the world, because the world is inherently unreliable. And this is one of those very fundamental things that this talk is about as well. Illness shows you one of the fundamental unreliabilities of this world. So you move your mind away from that, and then you move it on to the refuge within, the Atta Dipa, the Dhamma Dipa that the Buddha talks about. You take yourself as a refuge, Dhamma as a refuge, and you look for a refuge within yourself. And of course that is been specifically explained by the Buddha to be the 4 Satipatthanas. So you need that movement of the mind. You need that re-evaluation of the world. Where are your values? What is your priorities? What is important to you? To be able to let go of the world and then move to the refuge within instead. So that is right view in a very practical sense, right there for your meditation practice, to enable you to actually do this practice properly. It becomes so fundamental and so important. So what is this right view that we're talking about? And right view is defined in a number of different ways in the Buddhist suttas. But of course, one of the most important ways that it is defined is as the 4 Noble Truths. This is how it is defined in the Noble Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path, Sammaditthi, is defined as knowing the 4 Noble Truths. The same thing for dependent origination or dependent cessation. It is the 4 Noble Truths at the beginning there. So this is probably the most important way of thinking about right view in the suttas. Now, one of those 4 Noble Truths is, of course, the Noble Truth of suffering, dukkha satcha. And within the dukkha satcha, you have a large number of little segments to explain what dukkha satcha, the Noble Truth of suffering, is. But one of them is viyadipi dukkha. Also, illness too is suffering. Quite literally is what it means. Illness too is suffering here. And it's one of those strange things. Illness too is suffering is an aspect of right view according to the Buddha. It's very interesting because we might think, and this is how people often think, well, we all know that illness is suffering. Why is the Buddha saying this? What is the point of saying something which apparently is so obvious? Illness is suffering here. And of course, the point is that even though we know that illness is suffering in one way, we don't really know it in the profound and deep sense. And that is really the problem. We know it superficially, but we haven't really taken it on board in a deep way. And that is why it is included here. So what this means is that there is a vast scope for contemplation about dukkha. And that is why it is mentioned in the first Noble Truth, so that we can actually approach the understanding of the Buddha. And this is precisely why we see so many problems in the world now between, among all kinds of people, and Buddhists included, why people are suffering so much. Suffering from, of course, the illness itself, but also suffering psychologically because of the fear, and that fear and the all of that is probably far greater kind of suffering than actually the suffering from the illness. Once you get ill, you tend to go with the flow, but it's beforehand that people suffer far, far more. Why is that? Well, really, it is because they haven't contemplated this first noble truth sufficiently, in particular the idea of illness is suffering. And what will happen to the vast majority of people? You go through COVID, the coronavirus crisis, and eventually we come out on the other side, which of course we will. Eventually it will die down again like everything else. This too is impermanent. And then for a while, it's interesting. You read some of the newspaper articles online that you see these days, and people saying the world will change, the world will be a different place after coronavirus. And of course it's true, because the world is always changing. And that right now the change is a bit more dramatic than usual, but basically it's just the same aspect as the eternally changing world. But they are saying that once we get out, maybe society will be changed. Hopefully we will be a bit more caring, a bit more circumspect. We will ensure that we don't have the same problems with pandemics in the future as we're having now. But I think this underestimates the human mind. It underestimates our tendency to forget about these things. We forget about these things so fast. It is there with us for a while, and maybe with this particular pandemic, it might be with us for a few years. But it's only a matter of a few years, maybe a decade, and then the whole thing will be forgotten. And then we're back to the same old ways, oblivious of this terrible crisis that we had only a few years ago, back to being intoxicated by our shallow and fleeting sensual pleasures, and then we forget about the reality of the world. And this is the problem with life, the intoxication with the perceived happinesses of the world, which are so fleeting and so shallow and don't really give any happiness. And we forget about the suffering. And next time the pandemic, the next coronavirus comes around, then of course, again, we are going to suffer in exactly the same way because we haven't learned anything from it. So as Buddhists, we try to do something slightly different. We try to do better than that. We try to avoid falling into the same trap again and again and again. And this is what this contemplation about illness and the contemplation about coronavirus, the coronavirus contemplation. We should write a sub-commentary where we add a bit about coronavirus contemplation, I think, because I'm not sure if they knew about pandemics at the time of the Buddha. They probably did actually in some ways, but maybe not quite to on this scale. But anyway, so there you are. That's just an idea for a sub-commentary on the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, on the aspect of illness is suffering here. So how do we contemplate this? And of course, one way of contemplating it is right now, just seeing what the world is like right now at this present moment, understanding the suffering that this actually brings. And now it is really in your face. And this is why this is a golden opportunity to understand better what the Buddha means about viyadi pidukkha. Illness is suffering. Now we really have no choice but to face the problem of suffering, why it is a problem. So this is one way of doing it, and of course it is very powerful at the moment. Another way of thinking about illness is one that I often use, and that is just to remember that illness is always part of this body. The idea that we feel healthy, the very word health implies also suffering. Implies illness. So health and illness always go together. So if you are happy about your health, you should always remember that that health only exists because illness also exists. These two are opposite sides of the same coin. What that means is that the illnesses are always there. They're always part of us. We carry them around with us. They're just waiting for the right conditions to sprout out and to kind of emerge from the internal, from our internal selves. Whether they are cancers, whether they are heart problems, whether they are coronaviruses, or whatever else they are, all of these things are just there, waiting to come out from inside of us. And this is one wonderful way of thinking about it. And one way to check out if you have understood this is to use this nice little saying which Ajahn Brahmali always uses. And that is, when you go to the doctor, if you say to the doctor, "Doctor, doctor, something is wrong with me," that means you haven't understood the nature of illness. But if you go to the doctor and say, "Doctor, doctor, I'm sick today, something is right with me," something is right with you, that is when you have understood what illness really is about. Illness is not an aberration of reality. Illness is part and parcel of what this life is about. And the more you get that, the more you see that, and please use this coronavirus situation to reflect on this, the more you will actually understand what the Buddha is talking about in his first noble truth. So if we think about this in this way, and we understand how the illness is part of reality of life, the reality of existence, what does that do to us? And it does a couple of things. And the first thing it does, of course, it gives us rise to more compassion. It gives rise to compassion because we see all these people in the world who are all suffering. But at the same time, while they are suffering, they are in the darkness. They don't really understand what is going on. As soon as the coronavirus situation is over, they go back to the same oblivious ways, as silly and as blind as they were before. And when you see that, you feel a sense of, it's kind of heartbreaking almost. There is the opportunity for understanding the world in a deeper way, but they don't take that opportunity. Why? Well, simply because they are blind. They are walking in darkness. And this suffering, combined with the idea that we have no idea what is going on, that we are blind, that we are deluded, well, that should really give rise to a big amount of compassion for everyone in the world, because we are really in a very deep mess. And of course, if you look at how the Buddha talked about these things, the Buddha is often said to do his meditation after the meal, for example, in the suttas. And one of the meditations he said to use is the Maha Karuna, the great compassion meditation. And why? Well, because he sees this with utmost clarity, how we are all suffering so much, yet at the same time, how we are so blind, how we are in darkness about what is actually going on. So this is the first thing that happens when you reflect on the First Noble Truth in the right way. But the second thing that happens, which is even more interesting to my mind, is that it shows you the shortcomings of our world. It shows you how we tend to think of the world in the wrong way, how we forget about these shortcomings, and that is why we get so shocked when the coronavirus comes around, how we think that our governments and our health authorities should be able to control this in a better way, but of course they never are. The reason we are so shocked is that we think life is better than it actually is. We think this existence has more potential and more happiness than it actually has. But this existence is inherently problematic. It is deeply flawed. And of course, illness is only one aspect of the deeply flawed nature of our existence. Illness is one thing. If you look at the other factors of the First Noble Truth, there's a large number of factors there. And when you understand it completely, you understand the fundamentally flawed nature of our existence. And this remembering that suffering, that illness is suffering, is one aspect of that. And what happens when we remember this is that we start to turn away from the world. We start to look at the world in a different way. We start to become much more interested in the spiritual path. Why? Because we understand that the world outside is so inherently unreliable, so inherently fraught with suffering and problems, that it is on the spiritual path, it is within, it's in the mind, within ourselves. That is where we need to find a refuge. There is no refuge in the world outside. There's only problems and suffering to be found if we keep on in that particular world. And that is the big message of contemplation of suffering in this particular way. So the idea of contemplation of illness, I should say. So the idea of contemplating the coronavirus can be very, very powerful. And I really recommend you to take this opportunity as much as you can to do that. And if you do that, then it will be a very powerful boost to your idea of right view, where the refuge should be found, what really matters in this world, why the Buddha talks about meditation practice within as a real refuge. And then, as you think in this way, you start also to realize that the coronavirus really is just a metaphor. It is a metaphor for all the problems in the world. You start with the coronavirus and then you expand out your vision to include all the problems in life, all the things that we are facing, from climate change to wars to whatever it is in the world, for the problems of family life or people dying or whatever it is, all the coronaviruses of the world, metaphorically speaking. And as you bring all of those things, then you make the coronavirus situation into something very powerful, and you move towards right view, and that will be for your and everyone else long-lasting benefit and happiness. Thank you very much.